Good afternoon to everyone. Now it's my turn at the end of this Thursday because it has been a very important and interesting day. I feel that we are going to finish with an issue that it's also very important when we are talking about work skills research and families research, and I hope to contribute to your sometimes not answers, but more questions about it. So when we were talking about this training course, we talk about what kind of issues can it be important to work in regard to family research. And perhaps because of my work at the college, at university, I put some, I make some suggestions to my colleagues and say, why don't we talk about sampling? Because in fact, today's work is like a path in research. We talk about what kind of paradigms, what kind of conceptual work we can develop. Christina and Anita talk about systematic review, but now we are going to finish about sampling. Sampling issues in large and small scale family support workforce skills research. And I was like, okay, so sampling is something that is very important, and when we are doing research, we know that it can be defined and it can affect our results. But sometimes when we are reading papers and reading projects, it's something that it's not quite explained and not quite, and we don't pay enough attention. So, sampling, although it's part of the process of research, and we have, for example, here, begin to identify the problem. And when we are talking about the problem, of course, we are talking about the phenomenon, the construct. Sometimes the way that the research problem begins to define what type of paradigm and what type of design we are reaching for, but also what kind of population and what kind of sample we are going to work with. So, in fact, when we are working this, when we are talking about the process of research, we focus on several decisions. But today, I'm going to talk about sampling. I don't know, perhaps this is something that you already know, it's a refresh, but sometimes it's important to reflect and to give some attention to this type of decisions. So it's very often for researchers to begin to, and we see it, for example, with the questions you asked to Anita and to Christina, for example, that we feel very excited to write about results. But sometimes, as important to talk about what result, it's also important to talk about the path that leads us to that type of research, in that type of result. So, I don't know, there is an island, it's Research Island. You don't know me that well, but I really enjoy some kind of digital tools and things like that. So I thought, okay, let me begin with the Research Island. But Research Island, for those who know it, it's a very old picture from the 80s. So I thought, don't we have an upgrade of this image? And so I brought you the update of the image. So this is research. And what do we see in this image? In fact, the researchers are multitasking people because they have to know a lot of things, theories, research papers, all projects, things like that. Also, be interested in things, take decisions. And so it's quite often that in the middle of these so many tasks that we have to develop when we are doing research, sometimes there are some small things that begin to be more vulnerable and forgotten in our projects. So, sampling. Okay, so sampling is something that can come in the middle of the path of research, but also, do not forget, it can on the beginning of the research. Because as you see, there are some particular type of participants that sometimes work as a research inspiration, isn't it? For example, some special group of individuals, and when we want to compare them, and you talk about it today, when we talk about, for example, some type of families, or when we want to compare to normative families, is because this type of families, in fact, bring us some interest in getting knowing more about their functioning, their practices, and so on. Sometimes there are a special population that can be selected because of a particular experience. For example, sexual abuse. You talk about aggression and violence today here. But also it can be becoming a new parent, and this can be a status. It can be a new role in their lives that can bring some interest in studying them. But we also can have this type of inspiration because, for example, we want to study some exceptions. Why does something, for example, work with some types of population, type of groups, and the other thing does not work with this type of groups? So, as you see, samples can be very interesting and can be a source of inspiration. Also, sometimes we have other features, for example, outliers. It's so usual for us to analyze the outliers and say, okay, this one have a very atypical answer to this type of question, so let's exclude it because we want our study to have validity. So why can't we have a research about these outliers? So as you see, the sampling issues can become, in fact, a source of inspiration when we are designing and projecting a research. I have here something that's very common also when we work with families and, for example, children and adolescents. It's what went wrong. Okay? We sometimes typify the type of developing issues and behaviors and practice, but there are some minorities for whom this type of practice and activities do not work. So what went wrong? Sometimes this also can be a source of inspiration. We have, for example, another thing that's when we are looking at families, we can look, for example, at subtypes, and these subtypes can also be interesting to research. So, this is to make a point. Not only sampling can be important in the middle of the process of research, but also it can be a first stage in this study. Okay. Another important thing is when we are designing our study, one of the things we have to be very careful is to define who am I studying in reality. Of course, we are talking about the population when we're talking about normative families, for example, or we are now talking about families with children with special needs. But who am I? So the first step we have to follow is clearly define the target population, because we have to define whom are we going to focus our research on. But, for example, I don't know of you, but sometimes I'm multi-interesting. And, for example, I know Portuguese Sign Language. And, for example, in Algarve, we have like about 30 deaf children in all Algarve. So, if I want to study deaf children, it's normal. I can propose myself to study all the population. But because this population, this specific population, it's very narrow. There are few of them, so it's very easy for me to reach this population. But as you know, you are developing your studies, and as you well presented it this morning, some of you, but sometimes populations are too big. It's impossible to reach for everyone. It has a lot of disadvantages, and we can have sampling techniques to help us to take some decisions. So, when this happens, we have to select what type of sampling frame do we want to achieve. Because also, sometimes it's like a fake. if you are you have a lot of hungry, you can try to pick a very small slice, but this is going to have a disadvantage in your research. So you have to be very focused and have criteria to include and to choose about your sampling. And also with this, you have also to have a sampling technique. Well, sometimes these sampling techniques are not well explored and well explained in the research and, for example, in the papers that we consult. Well, we are going to talk a little bit more in the continuous of this presentation about some sampling techniques. But it's not the main, it's important, but it's also not the whole of the cake, it's just a slice of the cake. The other is to choose a sample size. And for example, what happens sometimes is, okay, so we choose a sample, and sometimes when we go to the result and to analysis of the results, we have some limitations. What kind of proceedings, what kind of analysis can we do? Because we have limitations in respect to the size of the sampling that we have. So I thought that this could be also an issue important for us to address here today. And then, well, we have the collecting data, and also, for example, sometimes imagine that we are working with a survey. We have problems in getting answers, so there are also some limitations in some questions, some situations we have to be careful about in the process of working with the sampling. Well, let's begin with the beginning. We have a population, for example, and of course, most of the times we cannot work with all of it. So we have to choose a sample. But this sample is not any sample. Sometimes we want the sample to have features, to have characteristics that allow us, for example, to be able to take some decisions in regard of, for example, the generalization of our results. So, and if you want to do that, you have to be very careful with the type of sample and with the criteria that you have when we are choosing it. This is clear for you, correct?
Yes, good.
In respect to this sample, perhaps, there are some areas where, for example, we can try to control the representativeness that we can achieve with the sample. But, for example, there are other type of studies that for its problem, its research question, the sample, the representativeness is not a problem, because we want to study the specificity of a group, of a small sample of this population. And our problem is not the population, it's the features that turn this group so special for us, okay? So, for example, a case study. We can use it, or for example, in some focus group, we also have this type of criteria. So, some recommendations. When we are choosing a sampling technique, when we are, begin of the beginning, the most important thing is your research question, as we also already hear in this training course. So your problem, your research question is everything, because it's going to inspire all the decisions you are going to make in the next steps. So at the beginning, somehow you have to define the unit of analysis. What are you studying? And your population. For example, identify the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the population and the specificity of its size. For example, if my research is about deaf children and I want to study deaf children in Algarve, okay? So I will not have, my inclusion criteria will be all the deaf children, for example, that are, because since the education it's mandatory, so they are in school, so it's, for me, it's easier to define what type of group am I going to use. My sample, it's my population. But sometimes if, for example, I want to study children, I have to, because we have a lot of children. So here I have to take another type of decisions. In here I will have inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria, because it's important to define this a priori. And this stage ends when the size of the population of the study is known. So this you must know, and this must be a parameter that a priori you must try to get it. So you can take decisions that are accurate in your next steps of the research program, research process. And to select a sample, it is necessary to define also what are you studying. And this depends on the research and of the aims, the objectives. And second, you have to determine if one is going to work with the population and with the sample, because sometimes there are advantage and disadvantage, and you have to take this type of decisions. For example, as I told you before, if this population is small, you can have access without restriction, then it's preferable to work with the entire population. But on the contrary, if the population is too large or difficult to work with, then it's convenient, it's just a small slice, a sample. Also, when you have to use a sample, you have to define what type of technique are you going to use it when you are selecting. So it is well, the first point is, are you going to use a probabilistic or non-probabilistic technique for collecting your sample, for selecting your sample? I don't know if these are two terms that you already know, but I believe so. And in the fourth stage, you can calculate the sample size. Okay? I don't know, but for example, some of my students sometimes have lots of questions in regard to this aspect of the sample size. And today I'm going to talk about some methods that you can use. And you can search, I will leave some suggestions, and you can search for it after. You will have access to the presentation, so you can use it. As before, as Anita and Christina also talked about it, when you are selecting a sample technique and taking decisions in regarding to your sampling, be aware that you always can have bias. For example, you can have bias in regarding to the technique. Imagine, for example, working with families is not always easy. We were talking about it in the morning and at lunch. Sometimes we just use what we get. And when we have this type of criteria, it's normal that, for example, we can have some bias in this type of participants. For example, I have one student, and she enjoyed very much to study parental engagement in school activities. And she was like making her master during COVID pandemic. So we had a lockdown, and she has to use, for example, an online survey to collect her samples. So she was not picky about it. She put it in Facebook and some social networks, and tried to get as much as she could have access to. What is the problem? The problem was when we were analyzing the results, we find lots of difficulties because there was the type of families that answer to her question was not very diverse. They were very homogeneous. So why? Is it because it just reflects the population? Oh, it's because of the sampling technique, and this reflects the participants and the type of technique that was used in sampling. Also, for example, sometimes when we imagine that we go to a school to make collecting data. Sometimes imagine we go always because we in university have classes on Monday, Tuesday, and Friday. And so I have to go on Wednesday because on Wednesday I have the Wednesday afternoon free. It's very good to collecting data in schools. So I go there and I collect my data. What the problem is, sometimes I'm not aware of it, but I'm introducing some bias in my sampling because I sometimes can have a situational bias, because if I go on the afternoons, imagine that a group of children have activities, extracurricular activities at that hour, so I'm not reaching them, and they have features that are important for my study, and I'm not reaching them, not because my study is not well designed, not because my instruments don't work, not because I'm very sympathetic, I'm very smiley, so, but because there are some bias in my collecting data that I'm not aware of it. So sometimes we can have bias, and also, for example, a situation. Sometimes when we go, imagine with children again, I can go to the class, and sometimes I have children coming and say, okay, I want to work, and sometimes I'm not aware, but this type of situations can also bring some specificity in their behavior that lead me to evaluate that type of behavior in that situation that is not quite the same if I don't make this type of approach in the classroom. So there are several others. What I'm saying is be careful, because there are also bias in your sampling techniques and in your sampling decisions. So to avoid some sampling bias, well, I enjoy very much the pictures. Sometimes the pictures are easier with surveys, but I'm not focused on this type of technique to collecting data. I'm thinking more along broader way. So sometimes it's important to take some decisions a priori and define what type of sample do you want to use and in the population. Keep your when we are going to the places where we are going to make the collecting of the data, be aware of all of these behaviors and all of these sometimes situations that can affect the behavior of the participants, and also be careful with your type of instruments and the type of measures that you use. Also, if it's possible, don't take assumptions just because of this study. If you can, for example, make a triangulation and try to combine some data with, for example, a simple, bigger sample with some more smaller sample, and for example, make a focus group and ask for the participants what do they feel about the questions that you are researching. And also something that sometimes in community approach we do it, that is to get the participants involved in interpreting the results. So you see something, but then we make a second meeting with them and say, okay, I analyzed this and I saw this. Do you see the same? If this was what you were sharing with me in the beginning. So this can be important to try to reduce the bias. And be careful. Another sample techniques can be very hard to reach, but convenient sample, sometimes they have a lot of problems. So it's probably not the best option. And, well, this is a suggestion. But to reach for these a priori decisions also, it's important because some type of techniques, imagine probabilistic techniques, they are very expensive and they're harsh. They are not very easy sometimes to implement. So when you are making this type of decisions in regarding to sampling a priori, you can reduce cost and time, can optimize the resources that you are working with, can be more accurate when you are collecting the data, and also in the data that you receive, they can also be more accurate and more intensive and exhaustive. And also, if you sometimes control this type of situations, in the end, you also have more possibilities for generalizing your data to other groups, into a population, okay? Well, so let's talk about sampling methods. And you are looking at me, and I know when I'm teaching my classes, at this time I was like, okay, so you are looking at the leg of the chicken because you are hungry, but you are thinking in the end of the session. But now I want your help. So I believe everyone in the room has a mobile phone, correct? So I say I'm multitasking. So I don't know if you know Cool Everywhere. It's an online platform like Mentimeter and others similar, Slido for example. So you can get access through the QR codes, and also if you don't have a reader, you can use the link. Okay? And the question is? You will wait for a while, please. Yes, please. Sorry. May I?
No. Why not? You are overestimating our abilities.
See, this is a tool. It's a free tool. It's a very nice one. You have lots of questions, type of questions that you can use. And this is a suggestion that you can use in your future. Okay. Yes, can I?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, just 1 minute. Okay, so the question is, what type of sampling techniques do you know? Or do you use? Because you are already researchers, so you already use techniques in your projects. So just yeah, everyone can. Okay, and small letters only. Do not write sentences. Try to write with small letters and words.
Separated by.
No, just one, then
Just one.
one, then two. Can you put several or just one? No, you can.
And send submit one, submit first.
Yes. So. Okay. No. See, it's very interactive because you are inserting is doing the upgrade.
It's full now.
Close.
Close, okay. Okay. So, as you see, my next slides are already here in your answers. So, the most common one is convenience, and we also use a snowball technique in our sampling. One of the when I tried to make some research in regard to the type of sampling that's most used in the family research, and this is according to my research. It's convenience samples. So I understand why, but it's important for us to also understand that when we are reaching for sampling that are convenient, it's very convenient to use it, but sometimes it's very limitative in the other section of the results to analyze it. Okay, but we also have some stratified, non-intentional, randomized, random probabilities. We also have probability, randomized. Okay, what you see, it's because of the form, is in regard of the ways you write it, but we can see some main response. Very good. Thank you very much for your help. Just 1 minute. So, mainly, this is a tree that you already know. So when we are talking about sampling techniques, it's what you write. You have probability sampling methods when we can have, for example, simple random sampling, cluster, systematic and stratified random sampling. And in the other way, we have non-probability sampling, where we have, for example, convenience, one of the most used technique, judgmental or purposive, snowball, and quota sampling. I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining each of one, and I also bring this image that has some information in respect what differentiate each of these techniques, but my interest was in trying to search for what kind of other techniques are researchers also using, okay? So, we have in regard to probability sampling, you know what probability sampling means. It's when we have criteria regarding probability when we are selecting our sample. And we want our sample to have, in our technique, anyone from the population has the same probability to be part of our sample as another individual. But simple random, and you see, okay, it's randomly, we can choose. I remember when I was in college, we have a bag and we put some numbers and we tried to collect the numbers to remove and to identify what will be the individuals that were going to make part of the sampling. But also we can have cluster because it has, we are now giving some importance to some features of this information of the individuals. Sometimes we have also stratified, and I believe this one is very used in our research also, when we know that, for example, our population has some kind of features, and we want to have the same the same expression of individuals in our sampling, and systematic sampling when we are going to, for example, in intervals, we are going to select people, but there are also multi-stage and multi-phase sampling. This is when, for example, the researchers engage the selecting of the sample in stage or in steps of the research. For example, first, imagine that I'm going to do a research in Algarve. And I'm going to identify what kind of for example, Portugal. We have several districts, and from each district, I'm going to select some councils, and then I'm going to apply some other technique to collect this data. In this part of these stages, that this type of decisions, they are going to dictate how I'm going to select my samples. So it's not something that I collect in one stage only. It's something that I'm going to collect in several phases. And also we have the dimensional sampling, and we are going and we are talking about the sampling. The dimensional sampling is, for example, when we try to introduce some dimensions in our sampling. For example, imagine that I want the professionals, some type of professionals in my sampling. And for example, in the skills, in the family skills, we have this type of criteria. So this means that dimensions going to dictate how I'm going to collect my sampling. Also, we have a non-probability sampling. So this is the most used: convenience sampling, the purposes sampling, the snowball sampling, and the quota sampling. And I was read about, and I get to know that sometimes convenience sampling is also known as a self-selection. For example, some people can say, okay, I don't mind to be a part of your research, so I'm self-selecting in the sample. Or accidental sampling. So, okay, so you left your professor office and you come outside and you're like, okay, I have to collect several students, university students to my study. And you look at, okay, so I'm going to see what kind of person, for example, kind of students passes by, and I'm going to invite them to be part of my my research. But also in respect to online and well, this world, we have also, for example, online sampling, and researchers have several alerts in respect to this type of sampling, because sometimes they are very helpful, because we get a size of a participant size very well, very good and very interesting, but
Big response.
yes, but it's sometimes also a very, it brings us problems in regard to the representativity, in regard to the quality of the sampling, and sometimes your results are not, in respect, are not because of your instruments, it's because of the sampling that you achieve. And also, for example, sometimes there are some researchers that put the surveys, for example, or an invitation for a research in a network, and this also can be done, and also can be a very valid technician, but technique, but it has some limitation also. Hazard sampling, it's like casual sampling. Also, it's mentioning an extreme sampling. Imagine, well, that the outliers that we will talk about before, okay? So this is extreme group that doesn't work, doesn't behave like the others, so we propose to study them. Okay. Also, sometimes we have to have technique sampling in stages of our development. For example, I think it was Anita and Christina who told that in family research, there are several research in respect to trial, to intervention studies. So when we are doing this, we have an intervention group and we have a control group. And sometimes when we have a control group and we cannot have, for example, an experimental study, we sometimes control the features of the control group in order to have like an equivalence to the features of our intervention group, so we can control it as, for example, confounders in our study. Okay? Well, and I believe this is not a novelty for you, so regarding of the technique, we have some advantage and disadvantage, okay? For example, when we are using a propulsive sampling, it's easier to do, but sometimes, for example, it has some, so when we want, for example, some external validity, we have, for example, to have a probability sampling technique besides our research, our design, okay? When, for example, we want more depth in our analysis, it's the convenience, it's the propulsive sampling that is a better answer, okay? So I'm not going to explore because I have another type of chocolates in this presentation, but what I say is you have advantage as in everything and disadvantage. So what my presentation is about is you must be careful for what you are going to choose, because but everything has a place. So, I don't know if you see, but everyone today present in pairs. So, Anita and Christina presented, okay, I think it's John and Ivanka, and I'm alone, and I felt very alone. So, I thought, why do not ask to chat group, because it's chat GPT, about the sampling techniques. So, and I asked them, are there other techniques than non-probabilistic, probabilistic and probabilistic techniques? And he answered me, I think it's a he, I don't know. They say sometimes we also have respondent-driven sampling. That is a type of non-probability sampling used to study, for example, populations that are to reach. We have adaptive cluster sampling, For example, it's a probability sampling that involves adjusting the cluster size in real time based on preliminary estimates of the population size. He answered that are another studies that talk about time location sampling, that is when we are going to study populations that are mobile, so as homeless, for example, or migrants, migrants, so we have to have a random sample of time location periods as a technique to try to find this sampling. Network-based sampling. Okay, so, and also in the end, he gave me this speech saying these new techniques of sampling have been developed to address specific challenge in social science research and can provide more accurate and representative samples than traditional methods in certain contexts. Okay, so what we are going to do is we're going to adapt our techniques according to our needs in research. So it's very expected. But then I question, what more can I bring to this session? And I said, okay, this is GPP, so I tried to search for example, researchers that talk about sampling in the specific fields of family research. And I find that in the 80s and 90s, it was a question that really concerned researchers, but nowadays it's a little bit stopped. So I thought perhaps this could be in the future, it could be a new research that we try to develop. So, for example, he's old, but he talked about the panel studies, where, for example, in the family studies, we can try to follow a family in a longitudinal study and simultaneously, for example, make comparison with transversal studies. You know, for example, we have a family, we are going to evaluate them in several moments, but also in the same moments, we are going to evaluate children or parents with children with the same age and in the same circumstances. And this could be a form of validate our work. Also, well, we talk about the importance of control groups, and already here the colleagues talk about some of these worries. Okay, so it's very important. It's a challenging, and Raquel was talking about. This is one of the main difficulties in it's 2023, and we continue to have this type of concerns in regard to our research. But I went forward and I say, okay, let me just look at some type of systematic reviews in the field of family research and try to see if the sampling techniques are that different. And so what I saw in some, in very curious way was, in fact, our research. It's much direct to interventions, and therefore we have a lot of questions in regarding sampling techniques with the group of intervention and the control group. Also, we have worries. For example, we have this study where we want to validate participants from specific groups, and so we take some decisions in order to validate our techniques in our collecting data decisions. Again, intervention and control groups. And I, for example, sometimes when in child studies, because this is a very multi-professional area, so we have, for example, other professionals that apply other decisions in this regard. For example, when we are doing cross-cultural studies, or when we are doing, for example, national surveys, they have some concerns and, for example, apply some multi-stage or multi-steps sampling techniques. Okay. And then I thought, okay, so I found that, I don't know if you already know this, that they are, for example, it begin to have to exist some some multinational enterprises like Amazon that everyone knows here that have services to help researchers to collect data. I don't know if you already know this. So you have, for example, this part, this Amazon Mechanical Turk, and it's a platform that helps researchers to collect big sample data. You can put them you can negotiate the type of, normally our surveys, and you can give them your instruments, what type of, you can define what type of sampling you want to achieve, what is your population, and they will help you to achieve this population. And you think, okay, this is in another country, it doesn't happen here, but it's growing. As you see in that chart, it's beginning to grow. And I'm like, okay, so for example, if I'm doing a psychometric study, it's normal, I want to reach a bigger sample. It's different when I'm doing a case study. And this is also happening. And so I asked my friend, so, Chetla, in family studies, what is the most used sampling technique? And he said, okay, again, it's convenient sampling. This method involves selecting participants based on their availability and willingness to participate. And this is our experience also. Okay. Okay, so he said, okay, so convenient sampling may result in biased sample and limit the generalizability of the results to a larger population. So, as expected, our sample techniques, they have weaknesses and strengths. Okay, they are already identified. So, you can, for example, if you have some decisions to make in your research, you have some, you can find some information that may be useful for you, okay? Sample size. I believe this can be a problem for you also, okay? So, first thing first, it depends on the type of study that you are going to develop. If, for example, you are developing a more qualitative study, so you have some criteria. If you are going to make a quantitative study, you have another type of criteria. As I say, I enjoy the pictures because it's so. Normally, when we are reaching for a quantitative approach, we want bigger samples, and we have quantitative studies. We are more focused and smaller sample. For example, when we are trying to reach a bigger sample, there are some values that you can use to calculate how big do you need, for example, to try to achieve the alpha of 5% of error, for example, to achieve some effect size. There are tables that help you to decide these type of decisions. There are formulas that help you try to reach these type of decisions. Personally, I really enjoy this software. It's GPower. It's a big friend. And if you do the type of, if you insert your proceedings, he will give you the size sample that you need in order, for example, to have power in our analysis, to have an effect size, a moderate effect size, for example, and to control, for example, an alpha of 5%. So,
what is the name of this wonderful?
It's GPower.
GPower.
Yes.
It's free.
Yes.
Free.
It's free.
It's free.
You can download
It's
it.
very convenient.
It's available for Macs.
I need it tomorrow.
Okay, GPower. So, and I thought, okay, let's have another task activity. Now, in group, perhaps in pairs? Yes, just one. If you go to your mobile phone in the same site, yes, if you go to your mobile phone in the same site and with your pair, with your partner, I invite you to try to Consider the following. Imagine that you want to, this is your research, of course, it's your research objective. Analyze the impact of a positive parenting program in children's quality of life. Okay, imagine that you want to do a research to investigate to this problem.
The QR, it was the same.
It's the same. It's the same. So I listed all the sample negative data.
It's there, it's there. It's in the same, it wasn't the other.
It's the same. It's the same. I didn't know. It's the same.
Yes, it's because you know when it was the
Yes.
I have a problem.
So maybe I don't know. All night about.
Yes, all time.
I already yes, of course. So, this is just an exercise for you to try to see. Sometimes the sample technique depends on your interpretation and depends on the aiming that you establish for your research. Yes, you can make 3, 2, yes. Just one, just one.
Catia, what was the question?
Imagine that after the line, this is a very general.
Everything else gets complicated from the beginning. That's always. No, that has the Chinese that was my idea. I went to I'd have to say, okay, yeah, fine. Then, it's out there, it's all over. It's the working out of them. What the exercise calculations represents. I was always very good, and the books never really told about it. And I never had the ever doing it, so I never really grasped it.
What you answer.
Probably.
You're very clever. You are all very clever because you bring attention to the presentation. So you thought, okay, let me just choose a random technique in order to, yes, of course. So, well, most of you answered stratified by an example. Do you want to tell me why? Which
Safety first. Safety first.
Safety first. So you not only want to have a probabilistic sample, but also you want to control some features in regard to this sample. But okay, this is the ideal. But as we were talking about regarding to the community intervention, we are always working with the real to get into the ideal. Okay. So also multi-phase convenience. Okay, 10%. Thank you very much. Because normally, sometimes we have to to choose this type of double sampling technique and simple random technique. Okay, so we don't have much time, so I'm going to do not work with you and just give you some final considerations, okay? So, as I hope I could I engage you in this type of issues and questions that you have to do in your research, in your own research design and decisions that you have to make. So this is not so casual and it's not so so random. This is intentional, and you have to be aware of the type of decisions that you are making, and sampling is one of them. So I'm not saying it's the most important, but I'm saying it's very important. And so when if you want to somehow control or at least be aware of what you are really studying, so the proposal, and it's not my proposal, it's a very old proposal indeed, and it's to get your population very well defined. So you get to know what are you studying really. So if you have a topic, a construct, a phenomenon that you want to study, and this can be a construct, but also can be some features in respect to some groups and some samples. So you should indicate how the study of the population is defined, is sample, is selected, and what limits do you identify to the ability to the potential of generalizability to this to your research. Also, you have to adequately describe the methods that you use to select, for example, to train yourself and to train, for example, you have some colleagues or some other researchers they are going to work, or some practitioners, they are going to develop an intervention. You have to be aware of a formation, a training, in order to control some diversity that can be brought to your research. And also the methods used to tracking respondents and updating their answers is something that's, well, it's challenging sometimes to reach for some type of sample. We sometimes, for example, in the academy, use the students from the university because it's easier, but nowadays it's not becoming so easier because they are a little bit bored of this type of thing. So we have to be careful to whom are we reaching. And also, always, the study should be placed in the context of the other data available on the topic. So the limitations of the sampling methods for interpretation and generalization are known. Okay? So the sample techniques which researchers use need to be evaluated and judged very carefully. Okay, so, and for example, when we are seeing some papers, we see that, for example, the sampling techniques are in proceedings, but it's very quick. Okay, so we send the link to the survey through Facebook and no more information. You must be careful about it. Sometimes the sample size. For example, we have a research. When you look at the total of participants, like 400 adolescents, 400 participants, and say, oh, it's very good. But sometimes the features of the participants are problematic because, for example, they are not connected. For example, and we have a study that we look about the outliers, and it's more outliers that, for example, we can identify some features in common with this type of participants. So, okay, and this is a big sample, so the proposal is be careful and try to define the sample a priori and to define the circumstances in you are going to do the study. Also, do not think that all studies are quantitative in qualitative studies, the sampling also, it's important, but it's important in the quality of this sample. To have, for example, diversity, so you can, for example, do some study, you can identify several features in respect to some situation or circumstance. So, in the end, the optimal sample size depends on the parameters of the phenomenon understanding, for example, the rarity of the event, of the expected size of differences in outcome between intervention and control groups when we are working with this type of design. And in the end, I reached for my friend and he said for me, okay, so sampling is a crucial aspect of family research, and it helps researchers obtain a representative sample of individuals or families, which in turn enables them to draw accurate and reliable conclusions about the target population. This is a more quantitative approach, I believe. So in the end, I finished with the sentence from Rodman that I really enjoyed, that today's solutions are tomorrow's problems. But enjoy sampling. Okay, so thank you very much.
So, any comments? Please.
Thank you for your lecture. I want to ask if the Amazon mechanical curve is in accordance of the data regulation protection of Europe.
It's a very interesting question. I get to know this site in a paper that I read, and I tried to research a little bit. I didn't have this type of criteria when I was analyzing, but it has a lot of situations that we have to question before we use it. It's not so simple. Yes. I think the message was also that. I think it's the beginning. The beginning is Amazon, but other companies are going to propose the same type of project. Also because here we are talking about family research, but for example in marketing and other areas, this is very common. So, but we have to make some questions and identify some limitations in this type of use. For example, I was saying, for example, psychometric studies, but we are proposing to test the instrument. For example, in the first stage can be important. For example, when you are testing with the private families, you have to use other techniques and try to use some other path, not this type. But I believe we are in a global information society, so I believe it's important for us to know that physics is, this is fine.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I have to comment myself if possible. Thank you for the presentation, Catia. I think that we have been smoothly moving from my point of view, for the best questions possible, because we start with the conceptual piece and then we move to the review of what was in the literature, and now we are deciding how to collect the information. So it was very well prepared and designed. I wanted to ask you if you have experienced some randomization or maybe other colleges, and now I was telling John on replying that my first experience with randomization, because as you say, in real situations we don't have that opportunity that much. It's quasi experimental design most of times, and we are addressing some challenges, like if you decide a way to collect all the data together, so you randomize when you have all the how do you say, the consents, or if you do it with other kind of randomization procedures, and then you have the challenge of the stratification, because how do you stratify, for example, if you are collecting data from several places, as is our case now? So I don't know if you or other colleges have some experience on this, because I think that maybe these challenges and how you are approaching can be useful for students to share and for myself. So thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. In respect to random, no, because as we are always trying to get away from this type of techniques, because it have disadvantages, not the costs, but the loss of. It's not easy to apply this type of techniques. Sometimes we can do it, for example, when we have we have in multi-stage, in multi-phase, for example, research, it's a stage, and then you use the random technique to collect the data. But for example, first you identify a community, identify, for example, a school, and then when you are collecting the data from the school, you use a random technique in order to limit the type of limitations that you can feel when you are doing a more generalized random study. It's not easier. It's not easy because, for example, one of the main problems that the researchers report is the responding rates that this type of studies involve. Okay, and so sometimes what you see is they insert this type of research in, for example, with companies, with enterprises that have resources, like to call to the persons, to send an email, to have contact that help you to assure a percentage of rating response in your research. So this is what I'm busy. But as I said to Christina, I believe that for me, this presentation brings me to several questions in respect to the field that we are working here, the family research. So I believe it could be of use try to understand what kind of limitations and solutions that researchers have been found and have been using in trying to apply some of these techniques that are more challenging in our works. So thank you very much, and thank you very much.